Julia Hartley-Brewer hosts a phone-in show on Rupert Murdoch-owned Talk TV. She seems to think that qualifies her to outright dismiss climate science, which is what she's done on this week's BBC Question Time. After Hartley-Brewer defended the continued use of fossil fuels, this exchange took place.
So, Julia, when you've got the UN saying, as Armand is referring to, that there's no credible pathway now
it's
to
a complete
reach
load of nonsense. That's not backed up by the latest IPCC.
Okay, well, listen,
it is
I don't
know. Nonsense.
Maybe you know better than the UN. This is what the UN are saying, and that the current policies may lead to 2.8 degrees warming this century.
Those climate models have been exposed as complete nonsense again and again and again. They are the most extreme end of the scientific models contained in those IPCC reports.
What Fiona Bruce was referring to there was a recent UN report that concludes we will not be able to meet the goal of capping global temperature rises at 1.5 degrees Celsius. But according to renowned scientist Hartley-Brewer, that's complete nonsense and not backed up by the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, report. Wrong. So in their report, the IPCC considers 5 scenarios that it uses to produce different climate change projections. The best case scenario involves a conversion to a global green economy. The worst case involves continuing to rely on fossil fuels and trusting new technology to mitigate its dangerous climate effects. So the latest report says this from the IPCC: considering all 5 illustrative scenarios, there is at least a greater than 50% likelihood that global warming will reach or exceed 1.5 degrees in the near term, even for the very low greenhouse gas emissions scenario. So no matter what we do, no matter which scenario we end up in, it's more likely than not that we won't cap global temperature rises at 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040, which is what the IPCC means by the near term. Julia Hartley-Brewer clearly had not read this. She is completely contradicting what it says in the report. And it gets worse, this is back in the report again, because we're currently living in a scenario that's much closer to the worst case scenario and nowhere near the best one being low emissions. Let's see what else Julia had to say, this time about climate change protesters.
They want to stop other people living good lives.
Yeah. If you want to have checking them out individually,
if you want to have limits on people's ability to access fuel, you want to make it more expensive to get a plane abroad, to use a car, to heat your home, you are going to be harming poorer people, and you're going to be harming poorer people in the developing world. In my view, these people are not just, well, I think they're tantruming toddlers who've clearly never been told no by their parents. I think it's time we've told them no. I think they are deeply, deeply immoral in what they're doing, actually.
So Julia's argument here is that it would be better for poorer people if activists didn't succeed in limiting fossil fuel emissions. Wrong. Among many conclusions about how climate change disproportionately affects poorer people, the IPCC was highly confident that increasing weather and climate extreme events have exposed millions of people to acute food insecurity and reduced water security, with the largest impacts observed in many locations and/or communities in Africa, Asia, Central and South America, small islands and the Arctic. Jointly, sudden losses of food production and access to food compounded by decreased diet diversity have increased malnutrition in many communities, especially for indigenous peoples, small-scale food producers, and low-income households with children, elderly people, and pregnant women particularly impacted. So clearly, the idea that action against climate change would be contrary to the interests of the world's poorer people is nonsense, which is why, going to these conferences, you often have those smaller, poorer nations who are saying, let's be really, really strict. And the people blocking that action tend to be rich oil-producing nations such as Australia, Canada, and the Gulf states. Now let's go on to another exchange between Hartley-Brewer and fellow panellist Armando Iannucci.
It's the developing world that's saying this has got to stop. It's the developing world that's saying we're on fire.
They're really not. The world is not on fire, and the world is not going to die, and we're not going to die. This is catastrophizing stuff that is not actually in the scientific sections of the IPCC reports. It's not.
Wrong, and wrong again. Among other terrifying predictions in their report, the IPCC was highly confident of this. Climate change and related extreme events will significantly increase ill health and premature deaths from the near to long term. Globally, population exposure to heat waves will continue to increase with additional warming, with strong geographical differences in heat-related mortality without additional adaptation. Climate-sensitive food-borne, waterborne and vector-borne disease risks are projected to increase under all levels of warming without additional adaptation. Yet despite being completely wrong in every single one of her climate change denying assertions, it didn't stop Hartley-Brewer from responding to an audience member in this pretty shocking way.
I think it's a bit ridiculous to say that climate change is not as bad as it is, because did we not all experience this summer where we got 40-degree heat? That's unheard of. And also the floods that have been happening in Pakistan, 30 million people displaced.
30 years ago as well.
Yeah, climate refugees is that's in our future. It's really immediate. And I think this summer should have shown everybody that we thought maybe it's going to be in a few 30 years time, 2050, but it's happening right now. And I think we really need to take action.
It's called weather.
Yes, Julia, it is called weather. That's not the issue. The issue is that it's getting worse. Now, this BBC graph shows the 10 hottest days since records began. As you can see on the right of the graph, 7 of them have occurred since the year 2000. They're not evenly distributed across the decades, I can tell you. But it's not just temperatures that are changing. The rate of catastrophic flooding is increasing too. This graph of data from a global insurance provider shows natural disasters between 1980 and 2019. The orange area at the bottom represents floods, landslides, and avalanches, all disasters involving water. They've gone up more than tenfold since 1980. Aaron, what do you make of the way sort of science gets discussed on a panel like Question Time?
Yeah, I think it's deeply inappropriate. I think in journalism, you've got a difference here between news and comment. And of course, yes, you're right. When it comes to comments, someone like Julia Hartley-Brewer can voice her opinion on something. But the way she is turning to alleged scientific facts, that is a factual claim which is not true. It's not accurate. And so that I think that errs from being a comment or an opinion to something which is actually factually incorrect, and it misinforms people rather than informs them. Really key detail here, Michael. Julia Hartley-Brewer was on BBC Question Time, of course, this week. She was on, I think, about 6 months ago as well. So she's a regular guest on BBC Question Time. Would you like to know the last time a representative of the Green Party of England and Wales was on BBC Question Time, Michael? It was last November. So you've got a political party with an MP. They win in council by-elections. In Dulwich, where the event was, the Green Party came second. But they don't matter. They also come second when it comes to the BBC in terms of what voices they want to prioritise to Julia Hartley-Brewer. So I think really, Michael, the blame here, yes, of course, she has to take a lot of blame. But her brand is to be provocative, to be this comedy bad guy. That's her brand. And I think actually the blame here is with the BBC, because when it comes to something like the climate change debate, I don't think you should allow somebody whose literal media brand persona is to be a comedy bad guy. It shouldn't be the case that they're allowed to outline absolute trash and claim it's there in the IPCC report, or it's a scientific data. It's called weather. Well, okay, Julia, why don't you go to the surface of Venus? It's 475 degrees C. You would instantly burn to a crisp. That's also just weather. What's your point? The Ice Age was just weather, where it would be impossible to undertake large urban settlements or farming across much of Europe. That was just weather. I mean, does that mean it doesn't matter? We'll just freeze to death now? It's just weather. Utterly moronic. Utterly, utterly moronic. It's on the BBC, Michael, because people like that exist. And look, she's allowed to have her views. But the way that she's repeatedly platformed on issues like this by an allegedly public service broadcaster, while you've got a political party, the Green Party, which has so much more traction within society, participates in democratic elections. They've got people in council elections, by-elections, did pretty well last year, being voted for and sometimes winning in places across the country. Okay, it's not the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, but it's a national political party. In Scotland, they're in government. Irrelevant. Sorry. Let's have this opinionated person who does radio shows for Rupert Murdoch instead. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for the BBC. It's embarrassing for the country. I've just come back from Spain. I did an event with El País this week. And you had people from politics, civil servants, journalists. You had a guy from Santander Bank, Telefonica, Airbus. The whole conversation was about climate crisis, about automation, about the challenges of the 21st century. And I come back, and this is, like I say, including people like Santander, Michael. It's a big European bank, and they're talking about green investments. That's not my politics, right? But when it comes to the climate crisis, they're immeasurably more serious about this than somebody like Julia Hartley-Brewer, or seemingly the BBC producer who commissions her and says, why don't you come on to, shoot your mouth about crap you haven't the first idea about? So I go from that environment, Michael, where actually there's a serious informed debate around the climate crisis, industrial policy, addressing these problems, at least trying to address these problems. We might not agree on the solutions, but we agree on the problems, so let's try and address them and sort them out. And I go from that, and I actually touched down back in London again yesterday, and Julia Hartley-Brewer's on BBC Question Time that night. That is everything wrong with this country. And often here on Novara Media, we're on the left. We criticise people maybe on the centre left, or the centre right, or even the right. And yes, it's true, many of those people are wrong about many things. But I think fundamentally, the issue in this country is about the media and media ownership. That is the fundamental issue. And actually, many people, I'm sure, on the centre or the centre right would have very different politics and very different views, particularly on the climate crisis, if it wasn't for people like Mr. Rupert Murdoch and his various factotums and water carriers and bag carriers like Julia Hartley-Brewer. Ridiculous. I don't know why the BBC insists on doing it. Why? Her, the IEA, the Taxpayers Alliance, they're embarrassing themselves and they should be ashamed.